Alright, hello STM. It is the Kohler 196cc single cylinder gas engine. But we're going to tear this down. We're going to show you some components inside, and then I will be putting it back together and making sure that it still runs. Alright guys, the first thing you should have is your PPE. So you want to make sure that you're being safe. CSA approved safety glasses. A service manual. Next thing I have is a torque wrench. The next thing we have is a 5/8 spark plug socket with an extension and a ratchet. That will allow us to remove the spark plug from the engine. And we have two size wrenches, a 14mm combination wrench. Combination meaning it's open end on one side and a box end on the other. And this is a 10mm combination wrench. I forget what size Allen key this is, but this Allen key fits the one and only bolt that we need to remove to get the fuel tank out. And we have a set of feeler gauges. These feeler gauges are used to check clearances between the rocker arm and the valve stem. We're also going to need to drain the oil out of this engine because I did put some in. So I have an empty clean container. We need a little bit of oil. I'm going to reuse the oil, but in case we need some extra oil or we spill the oil, I have some extra clean oil right here. To put the oil in, we're going to need a funnel. And last but not least, we should always have some sort of a shop towel or shop rag around to wipe our hands and wipe spills and whatnot. Alright, so the first thing we're going to want to do here is get the oil out of the crankcase. The crankcase is the bottom of the engine, which normally holds a crankshaft, which is one of our major components of the engine. One thing I also forgot to mention is when disassembling, it is okay to use power tools. When assembling, just make sure to do most of it by hand. I am going to use power tools just to speed things up a little bit. So we'll just remove that drain plug. Lose our drain plug. When you take out the drain plug, you're going to have this metal washer here. So this washer is actually a type of seal. Make sure you don't lose that washer. The washer must go back. The first thing we want to do is remove this air filter. To do that, we're going to undo the wing nut. This type of fastener is known as a wing nut. It has two little wings that we can grasp with our fingers to get leverage and then turn it. If the component looks like a cup, then let's use it as a cup. So I'm going to put the wing nut in there. Next thing is we have the air filter. So these are two 10mm nuts. These levers, the choke and the gas, need to be in a forward facing position so we can remove the cover without damaging these levers. We're going to get rid of these two nuts here, take those off, put them somewhere safe. Just pull on the spark plug boot. Just be careful, these edges are quite sharp. And I'm just going to put that aside. Now I can get at this hose. And I should be able to do it with my fingers. I just give it a twist, pull, and that whole assembly comes off right there. Okay, so in order to remove the exhaust, okay, the exhaust manifold and the muffler, I'm just using my electric impact wrench to remove those two bolts. And again, I'm going to flip this over, and I think I can put them in here. Before I remove the fuel tank, I'll remove the spark plug. I'll get my ratchet and make sure it is switched to go counterclockwise. There we go. And there are two 10mm bolts here. This whole assembly will come off, however, there is a spring, so you need to tip it and use your fingers, and the spring, just to show you, came out of this hole. I don't know if you guys can see it, came out of that hole there. Alright, I think we can remove the fuel tank now. So one bolt, I'm going to spin the engine around, and also holding the fuel tank on is two 10mm nuts. So I'll put this over here alongside our throttle assembly and get my 10mm wrench, and I'm going to just crack these loose, and then those should come off with your fingers as well. Now if you come over to this side, on the fuel tank you're going to see the fuel hose, which leads to the carburetor. The carburetor is what gives the engine its fuel and controls the amount of fuel that goes into the engine to make it run perfectly. And I hope you guys can see it. I'm going to twist a little bit and pull, and I'm going to pinch it as I pull it off just in case some fuel comes out. Okay, so now I can take this, gently tip it backwards, and then pull it out. This spring can come out. Just use your fingers, gently turn it so that the hook part goes down and out, and this rod assembly pops out from the carburetor, but the carburetor has to be pushed all the way in. Okay, there we go. So this rod assembly pulls out from this. I'll show you this. So this groove here, that little groove, there's a hole. I hope you can see it. That's where that rod goes. And there's another end, and that end would just hook into the second hole at the end of the governor lever, and the spring hook would be on the first hole of the governor lever. So after this rod comes out, the carburetor can slide right off of its two fasteners here. After that, we can take the spark plug wire out of its clip here, and I can remove this block. Now be careful. This carburetor spacer plate has a gasket on it. So inspecting this gasket, it's stuck to the spacer plate, and it doesn't look ripped at all, so we can reuse that. Now if it was ripped, obviously we'd have to replace it. Before we can take this heat shield off, we have to remove the starter. It's not a starter motor, but it is a starter assembly. We call it a recoil. A 10mm socket does the job, as usual. Now keep in mind, guys, these fasteners are different lengths. You do not want to use the wrong bolt in the wrong hole, because you're going to do damage. Okay, so there's two bolts on top. Now one of those two bolts actually has an electrical ground for the ignition switch here. When you put the fastener back, you want to make sure that electrical connector is also part of the assembly. In order to remove this without doing damage to the wiring, we have handy little connectors here that can just pull apart. So we're going to pull that connector apart, and actually another connector came apart up here. So just bear in mind, there's a female and a male connector, and on the engine assembly there's a male here which connects to the female, and same with up here. So you really can't mix these up. There's two more bolts on the bottom, and two. Okay, and we're going to gently pull the starter / recoil assembly away, and I'll put that aside. Next job, let's remove the engine valve train. It starts with the valve cover. There are 4 fasteners. Gently remove the valve cover because there's a gasket. As you can see, it just dropped out. Put the gasket in the cover the way it's supposed to go, and I'll put the bolts in there too. We're going to need a 14mm wrench, and we will place it on the fastener that secures the rocker. Now the secondary nut we call a jam nut, but in order to get these off, we're going to have to hold on to the rocker arm adjuster fastener and loosen off the jam nut. Once we get the jam nut off, jam nut and the rocker arm adjuster fastener here are actually, they lock together. These rocker arm adjusters will just rotate off. So at this point the rocker arms will just pull out. So I'm going to pull the rockers out. Next thing, I'm going to reach in and gently pull these push rods out. And we're going to keep everything together here, okay? And we'll put that away on the bench. Now at this point, we're ready to pull the cylinder head off. So 4 bolts come out, and then what you want to do is hang on to the head. You don't want it to drop on the floor. It might do damage to the fasteners or the threads on them. So after we do that, oh, I did forget one thing. What I did forget was this heat shield on the bottom. 1 bolt is already out. That was with the recoil assembly. The other 2 are here and here on the side. Okay, so we're going to remove those. And here's the cylinder head. Like I said, it contains 2 valves. You might think a valve would open the other way, but because of cylinder pressure, we have to open the valves inward. Always with a cylinder head assembly, you're gonna have a head gasket. This is a head gasket. Generally, we do not reuse these, but for school purposes, this gasket is not ripped or bent or torn, and it looks like it's gonna seal just fine. So I will be reusing this. But if you're ever taking an engine apart, you should be replacing the head gasket. From this point, you can see the cylinder and how the piston goes up and down. All right. On inspection of an engine, you always want to make sure the cylinder is nice and smooth. There's no scratches or scores. Otherwise, you'll be needing a new piston and maybe some machining, some honing on the engine cylinder. All right, so I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 side cover bolts. Actually, I can't really call this a side cover. This is, on most engines, the front of the crankshaft is usually called the front cover. So let's call that the engine front cover. And I'm going to gently remove this cover. Now bear in mind, guys, to seal up the oil, you've got 2 things here. You've got a lip seal around the crankshaft. Okay, the lip seal fits snugly in there. It doesn't allow oil to come out, dirt to get in. And secondly, we have a cover gasket. The gasket is a paper gasket, which is right here. Now it's fairly stuck to the block of the engine. I'm inspecting it. It doesn't look ripped or torn. It looks like it's in pretty good shape, so we will be reusing this for school purposes. But generally, I would say if you do take this apart, that gasket should be replaced as well as the head gasket. A perfect example of a bearing that supports the end of the crankshaft here, okay, is right there. And you know that there's oil in the case, so we have boundary lubrication as well between the balls and the bearing races. This is an inner race. This is the outer race. The outer race is secured to the cover, and the inner race is allowed to rotate via the ball bearings. And last but not least, the last thing I'm going to disassemble. I could take the crankshaft, the piston, everything else apart. I'm not going to do that. What I wanted to show you was how everything operates. Here's a camshaft. As you can see, the camshaft has these things called cam lobes. And riding on the cam lobes are these what we call tappets. The push rod fits in the tappet, and as the camshaft is rotating, when the high spot on the lobe, the camshaft lobe, comes up, it pushes on the tappet. Okay? As the high spot disappears, or it comes around to the lower spot on the camshaft lobe, the tappet will go down. Okay, so up and then back down. So that, and as that's rotating, that's happening over and over and over again. And it's all timed perfectly. So the cam lobe pushes on the tappet pushes on the push rod. The top of the push rod, it pushes on the rocker arm. And remember, I was saying the engine valves push inwards to open up instead of pulling up, so they push inwards, so we have to push them via the rocker arm and the push rod, and that will open and close the valves in the head. And as you can see, here's our crankshaft, how this operates to move the piston up and down. The crankshaft is composed of a main shaft which is centered. Then we have what we call a crankshaft journal. The journal is actually offset. And that rotational action and the offset journal on the crankshaft allow the piston to move up and down. Alright. And the connecting rod is that will actually go side to side with the rotation. So this is how we turn linear motion, linear being straight up and down via the piston, to rotational motion via the crankshaft. Now we've stripped the engine down and we're ready to reassemble. What's the first thing we're going to do here? I have to check the service manual, because with our camshaft and with our crankshaft we have two meshing gears. Alright? You remember, with the 4 strokes, the valves have to open at the precise time that the piston might be on the intake stroke and on the exhaust stroke. We don't want the valves to open at random. So what we call this is valve timing. How do we do this? If we check the service manual, it's going to tell you that there is a dot on the camshaft, and somewhere on the crankshaft gear is a dot. This dot on the camshaft is lined up with that dot perfectly. Can't be 1 or 2 teeth out. It has to be exactly lined up. And how we do that is, in the service manual it says bring the piston to top dead center. So where's top dead center? Top dead center is the furthest point that the piston can travel in the cylinder towards the top of the engine or towards the cylinder head. So there's our dot. We're at top dead center. Now we can install our camshaft with the dot meshing. So there's our 2 dots lined up. If this dot is over here and that dot is down there, the engine's not going to run. Okay, so these timing marks have to be aligned. Once that's done, I can put my side cover back on with my gasket. And I'm going to take my gasket, make sure I've got the correct orientation, which is that. Slide the cover on. Generally you'd put a little bit of oil or grease on the seal to allow it to slip over the crankshaft without doing damage. Now all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to snug these. Okay, I've just snugged them, and now I've checked my service manual, and my service manual says these fasteners should be torqued to 212 inch-pounds of torque. Now we know there's inch-pounds and there's foot-pounds. My torque wrench only shows foot-pounds. So how do I figure out inch-pounds to foot-pounds? 212 inches divided by 12 will give us approximately 17.6 foot-pounds. And I'm going to properly torque each one. How do I know when it's torqued? Torque wrench is going to click for me. So next thing we want to do is our cylinder head. We have these little guys and they're called dowels. These dowels, or dowel pins, will actually help to align the gasket, hold the gasket in place, and it aligns the cylinder head as well. The dowels will fit around one of these bolts into the cylinder head. So the gasket can only go one way. So I'm going to gently hold the gasket, make sure our spark plug hole is upright, and I'm going to line the bolt holes with their appropriate threaded holes. Again, the torque spec for the head bolts is 212 inch-pounds, which converts to, we divide by 12, we get 17.6 foot-pounds of torque. So my torque wrench is already set. What I'm going to do is a crisscross pattern. When you're torquing down cylinder heads, you never want to go around. You kind of want to do a crisscross pattern if there's 4. If there's more than 4, you want to start with the inside bolts and work your way to the outside. Again, in a crisscross type pattern. Okay, so that's ready. Next, reverse procedure, I'm going to need my push rods. Push rods, you kind of got to feel, because they have to slip in to the passageway and the tappet. Remember that this is the valve train. It has to be connected properly. The push rods push on the rocker arms, and if you notice here, there's an indent on one side of the rocker arm to accept the push rod. The flat side or bubbled side is to go on top of the valve. Okay, and I don't think these are different, so we can place them. Just make sure I'm lifting up on the push rod to make sure it's seated properly. At this point, I'm just going to secure it with the rocker arm fastener. And I don't want to do it too tight, but I just want it to be secured enough so that the push rod doesn't fall out of the rocker arm. Now at this point here, you're going to want to put your jam nuts on, but don't tighten them. So these are my 2 jam nuts. I'm going to wheel that down just so it barely touches the adjuster nut. Now I've checked my service manual, and there are specifications for a proper paper thin gap between the rocker arm and the top of the valve stem. This is a set of feeler gauges. What we have here is different thicknesses, and they are all marked, and they could be in metric, they could be in imperial. Okay, and they're all different thicknesses, and this is how we gauge how much of a gap we have between 2 components. So here I'm looking at my reassembly page in my service manual, and for valve clearance, the intake is 0.1 millimeters, and for the exhaust, it is 0.15. And this is how we do it. First of all, we have to make sure we have enough clearance to get the feeler gauge in the first place. So the intake, here I have set 0.1, 0.10, same thing, 0.1. And I'm going to put the feeler gauge in between the rocker arm and the valve stem end. I'll make sure it slides in and out, no problem. Now back off the jam nut and slowly start to tighten the adjuster nut until you feel a little bit of resistance while sliding the feeler gauge up and down. I feel some resistance. You want to not tighten or loosen the adjuster nut. So in order to do this, we're going to use 2 wrenches. Remember I said we need a 14 millimeter wrench. I'm going to put the box end over it, and I'm going to hold that steady. The next thing I'm going to do is take my 10 millimeter wrench, box end again, and I'm going to start to tighten, and we're going to tighten that jam nut until it locks against the adjuster. So if you don't do it right, the engine's not going to run right, or it won't run at all. Okay, so now I can get my feeler gauge in, and I feel a little bit of resistance or drag, and that is perfect. So our gap between the arm and the valve is 0.1 of a millimeter. For the exhaust, we got to switch to our 0.15 of a millimeter, and repeat that process. For this, there is a torque spec, but just to move things along. These valve cover bolts really only need to be snugged. There we go. And just by finger, I'm gonna put a couple of bolts in, make sure my spring is up, my wire is not caught on anything, it's not pinched between the cover and the block. Again, I'm just snugging it. I'll show you here. I'm just hitting the trigger gently and just snugging it up. Before I forget, I'm going to hook up my electrical. Again, what I was saying before is these can only fit one way, so you have a female and a male end, they go together. Push hard. Okay, the rubber insulator should cover the contacts. That keeps dirt out. Also, you want to make sure this carburetor gasket is intact and it's not ripped. If it is, it needs to be replaced. So we're going to put the carburetor on. Gently slide it over its fasteners. Make sure the gasket is flat, flush up against the spacer. As I mentioned before, this governor throttle rod assembly and spring, damper spring, wasn't correctly placed. What needs to happen is that rod needs to go through the spring. Okay, the hook part that goes like a zigzag, goes down and out, is going to connect to the second hole. So the hook goes in the second hole, down and under. Okay, the spring goes in the first hole. So I've hooked the spring onto the first hole, rod in the second hole. Now at the other end, we have to get the L part, and it has to go down into the, let me take the carb off just to show you guys again. It has to go into here, into this slot and down. There we go. The other end of that spring, there's a small hole. The hole is just in front of where that rod goes. Okay, so all you got to do is tip that up, hook that spring in here like so, and I'll show you, hope you guys can see that. It's hooked in, and then we just simply turn it 90 degrees and line up the bolt holes. So we're dropping the tank in, 2 fasteners through 2 bolt holes on the crankcase here, and the little Allen bolt should line up with a threaded hole in the front of the tank. And again, these don't have to be too tight, just so you feel some resistance. Turn it around, 1 and 2. And I'm going to attach our fuel line. And the fuel line attaches to a tube on the carburetor. And all you do is, if you guys can see, there's the tube, there's the hose. I'm just going to push the hose down. Normally there's a spring type connector there, but this one's missing it. Also make sure the fuel line is in these 2 clips. It's just to guide it so it doesn't kink or bend. If it kinks, then we can't get fuel to the carburetor. Our spark plug, I can start it by hand. Make sure I don't cross thread. And now we want to flip it so that we're going clockwise. Get that on. And this doesn't have to be too tight, just snug it up. Next in line here, working backwards again, is our muffler with the exhaust manifold. Moving back around to our carburetor, there's only 2 things left that I have to install. Again, these 2 guide holes are for these levers. Looking from the back side, I can see the studs and they're going through the holes. Our levers are in place. All I got to do is get this hose on here. So as I'm pushing, I'm going to guide that hose. Wiggle and push. Just wiggle it and push. And now our whole assembly can go on. I can get this spark plug boot back on its spark plug. And to make sure that that spark plug boot clips all the way down. Back to our air intake. I put the 2 nuts for that inside the cover for the air box. Snug them up. Now if you notice, the air filter has 2 flat spots. And on our air box there is actually 2 flat spots that lines up with. So just make sure you're putting your air filter on your air box the correct way. And the cover can only go on one way. Last but not least, our wing nut. And the engine's assembled. Okay guys, here's our assembled engine, and we're going to see if it starts. The first thing we want to do is make sure that our choke is in the on position. That helps with cold starts. Our fuel on-off switch, we want to make sure it's on, and that's towards the engine. And also our throttle control, we're going to flip it from turtle to rabbit. Well, we also want to make sure ignition switch is on. Here we go. And that's it, folks. Have a great day.